We're ready, yeah? Playtime's over. Hi, it's Tibby Singh, and in this video I'm going to show you how to point a brick wall. In fact, this one right behind me over here. Now, there's never one correct way of doing something, so I'm going to show you a few methods, in fact 4 in total. That includes pointing with a trowel and a brick jointer, a trowel and a pointer, a hawk and a brick jointer, and finally a mortar gun. These are a few main methods that can be used when it comes to pointing a brick wall, and I'm sure and hope you'll find one more suited for yourself. Now, the main focus in this video is how to point a brick wall. However, I thought I'd also touch up on how to rake out the joints and also how to mix mortar, because simply without the correct preparations, it will have an effect when it comes to pointing. Raking out means removing the old mortar, and it's imperative that it's deep enough, which should be a minimum of 15mm. But if you can go a little bit deeper, it's always better. I've heard people raking out the old joints using a joint raker. However, that would only work if the mortar is already soft and loose. For me, the best option and the quickest way to do this is to use a grinder with a raking blade. This includes raking out all the horizontals, which are called the bed joints, and the verticals known as the perp ends, because they are perpendicular to the bed joints, which are also referred to as perps in short. This has to be done with diligence, because the last thing you want is to grind out the brick when doing the perps. Yes, it's not the most pleasant task, and it can be very dusty, so just make sure you have the correct PPE on, and if you can connect the grinder up to a dust extractor, then that's a bonus. Once it's all raked out, you can wash away the dust in the joints, and whilst it's drying, we can do a mix. Now, for a standard mortar mix for pointing, and most commonly used is a 5:1 or 4:1 ratio, which is sufficient. So that's 5 or 4 parts of building sand to 1 part of cement, and the cement is what gives it strength, and we don't need it too strong when it comes to pointing. Also, the more cement you add, it will dry quicker, therefore more chances of it shrinking and cracking. Now, when it comes to doing a mix, you don't want to mix too much, so just mix the right amount, what you think you can handle. And it's always best to mix less at first, because you don't want it to go to waste. So I've got my 4 parts of building sand and 1 part of cement. And in terms of mixing, you can mix it on a piece of board or a bucket like this one. And I always like to mix it up dry first, just to make sure that the building sand and cement are mixed up properly. So you want to mix it up until you get the same consistency in colour, and until you can't see any sand or cement, and we're ready to add water. Now, it's important not to add too much water, because remember, you can always add more, but you can never take it out. And what I have here is plasticizer. Now, this is optional. However, I always like to add a little bit myself, because it makes the mortar easier to work with, and it also prevents any shrinkage and cracking. And the amount to use is usually stated on the back of the tub. Now, if you do add too much water, and you can see this mix is a little bit wet for a pointing mix, you can always add a little bit of sand and cement to the same ratio. So what I'm going to do is add 1 full cup of sand, and then 1/4 of cement, which makes it a 4:1 ratio. So the consistency we want for a pointing mix is not too wet nor too dry, and we can test this out by getting a trowel, placing some on it, and if we turn it upside down and it sticks to it, we know it's fine. So now that we have our mortar mixed up, or as brickies refer to it as muck, we're ready to start pointing. There's various different brick pointing styles or types, from V-shape, weatherstruck, flush and raked, but the most common and the one I'll be using on this wall is concave. As I mentioned, I'm going to show 4 methods of pointing, and the first being probably the most traditional and common methods that bricklayers would use. That's pointing with a trowel and a brick jointer. And the brick jointer has 2 sides. Wider concave for wider joints, and a smaller concave for smaller joints, which I'll be using. Okay, so when you've got some mortar on your trowel, what you can do is get your brick jointer and just tap it down, spreading it evenly across your trowel, like so. But just make sure you leave the front bit of the trowel clear, which gives you space to actually scoop up the mortar with the brick jointer, like so. And if it sticks to it like this, you know that the mix is actually correct. And don't worry if you don't get this method straight away, it might take a little bit of practice. A tip is to slightly tilt the trowel, almost like you're turning it upside down when you're scooping it with the brick jointer, like so. And once it's on the jointer, you can then fill in the joints, starting with the perps first. And what you need to make sure is that you get the mortar right into the joints, compressing it. Because if there's any gaps left in the joints, what can happen is water can get in, and if that freezes, it will blow out the mortar joints, also known as freeze thaw. Okay, so when you've done all the perps, then you do the bed joints. And at this stage, don't worry about the perps not looking neat and the snot sticking out, because we can clean that up afterwards. So once you've done all the perps and the beds, what you do next is what they call topping and tailing. And what that basically means is cleaning this intersection joint over here. And you do that by using the toe and heel of the brick jointer. So by pressing it at the top and bottom with the toe and heel, it creates a much neater joint, as you can see. And you can just go over the bed joint as well and do the topping and tailing again. And don't worry about these bits over here, what are also referred to as snots, because once the mortar has dried a little bit more, we can just scrape it off with a pointing trowel. And we don't want to do it whilst it's wet, because it'll start smudging the brickwork, which will look unsightly. And then once that is scraped off, we can just clean it off with a soft brush. So the second method of pointing is to use a trowel and a pointer, and this would be done in a similar way to using a brick jointer. So you'd have the mortar on the trowel, spread it out, lift it onto the pointer and just compress it and push it into the joints. Again, doing all the perps first, and then the beds. I'm not a big fan of this method because you do tend to smudge the bricks a little bit more than intended. And to finish it off, you would do it in the exact same way as I explained. So doing all the perps first, then the bed joints, and then going back to the perps to do the topping and tailing. And then wait for it to go off before you clean the snots off and brush it down. So if you're struggling to perfect the method of scooping the mortar off the trowel with the jointer or the pointer, then this third method might be more suited to yourself, which is actually using a hawk and a brick jointer. So you simply put mortar onto the hawk and then place it right next to the joint and basically sweep it in or shove it in with the brick jointer. And again, you do the perps first and then the beds. So place it right next to the joint and just make sure it's pushed in and compressed. And this is why it's important to get the mix right, because the last thing you want is this mortar to drop off onto the floor. And once you've done all the perps, then you can move along and do the bed joints. And because I'm right-handed, I find it easier moving from left to right as opposed to right to left. And once you've done all the perps and the beds, then again you'd go back to the perps to do the topping and tailing and finish it off in the exact same way as I mentioned. And again, once it's dried, just scrape off all the snots. And just clean it off with a soft brush. Okay, so if you're not keen on the first three methods I've shown you, then you cannot go wrong with this one, which is using a mortar gun. Now, it looks and operates in a similar way to a normal sealant gun. However, it is specifically designed for mortar. And depending on which gun you get, it might come with a few different nozzles. And this one actually has two. So you can see one nozzle is flat and the other one is angled. So the flat one is best to be used on the perps and the angled one for the bed joints. However, when I'm using the gun, I just use the angled one to do both the perps and the beds. But if you do have two guns and the privilege of someone actually filling the guns up for you, then I guess you can put the flat one on one gun and the angled on the other. And it also comes with a scoop, so you can scoop the mortar up and put it into the gun. Now, mortar guns are a little bit like Marmite. You either love them or hate them. And the reason why people hate them is because they always complain that they get clogged up. So this is when the mix changes from a dry mix to a wet mix. And not too wet so it starts to drip around the wall, which will look like a dog's dinner. Just the right consistency in order for it to come out and go into the joints. Me personally, I've never had a major problem using the mortar gun. Yes, on the odd occasion it might get stuck, and that might be because there might have been a stone in the building stand. So what I do is just take the nozzle off, give it a tap and put the nozzle back on, and you're good to go. Alternatively, if you have a flat screwdriver on you and you can just clear the end of the nozzle. Okay, so this is the consistency of the mix we need to aim for when it comes to using a mortar gun, and I've used the same ratio, so that's 4:1, 4 parts of building sand to 1 part of cement. But you can see it's a lot more wetter and what we call a sloppy mix. So if I just pick it up with the trowel, it'll just drop off like so. And then I can just pour it into the gun. And the reason why the mix is a lot more wet is because if you just imagine, the gun is pumping the mortar through this tube, so it's pressing it and compressing it at the same time, therefore rinsing the water out. So if it's dry in the first place, it's just going to get stuck halfway. So it can get a little bit messy when pouring the mortar into the tube. So another little tip, and what I've done is I've cut this funnel out of a bottle. So what you can do is just place it like so, and then just pour it in. And this way, you're not going to get it all over your hands. And I always leave a little bit of space from the top, which gives it room for the gun to just fit in and screw on. Okay, so I filled the gun up with the mortar and I'm ready to pump it into the joints. And when it comes to pumping the joints in with the mortar gun, you don't have to do the perps first and then the beds. And in fact, I prefer to do the beds first because you can have a continuous run and then go back to the perps. And the key is to actually leave it proud, so don't worry about it not looking tidy. Just pump it in and then walk away and let it dry. Because if you start trying to joint it up whilst it's wet like this, you'll just smudge the bricks. And because it is a wet mix, it might take 30 minutes and even longer to go touch dry. So just keep a weather eye on that. Another advantage of actually using a mortar gun is if we have any deep gaps like this one, it means we can just pump the mortar in right into the back. And that's not only good for structural reasons, but also it will prevent the mortar from shrinking and cracking. Again, keeping it proud, so when it comes to jointing, it will leave a neater and better finish. And I'll just exaggerate this, but it doesn't matter if you pump too much in like so. Just don't touch it. When it's touched dry, come back to it and it's jointed. That'll scrape off, no problem. Okay, so I've left this for about 45 minutes now. I've had my break, I've had a cup of tea. And the way to test whether it's ready for jointing is just press it with your finger. And if it doesn't leave any fingerprints, then we know it's good to go. But at the same time, we can feel that it is wet. So that is perfect. And same again, when it comes to jointing, you do all the perps first, and then you do all the beds, and then obviously you go back to doing the perps, what they call topping and tailing, like so. With this wall being all bricks, you can see this, they are slightly in and out. There's less consistency. They're up and down as well, and some joints are bigger than others. So another little tip when it comes to do the bigger joints is to use something with a bigger circumference, for instance, an offcut of pipe, or even a wheel brace does the trick. So I'll just demonstrate on this one over here. And you just treat this as a brick jointer. So again, you do all the perps. Make sure you push it and compress the mortar as well at the same time. And then you can do the beds and go back to do the topping and tailing as well, just to neaten the joints off. And then once that's all dried, you can come back to it and scrape off any snots and then brush it down with a nice soft brush, and it'll look perfect. Okay, so I've left it another 10 minutes just to make sure all these snots dry off before I start scraping it off with the pointing trowel, because the last thing you want to do is besmirch or smudge the brickwork. And finally, you can clean the brickwork with a soft brush, moving in an eccentric motion. The reason why you don't follow the joints is because the last thing we want is to dislodge the pointing that you've actually done. So that brings me to the end of this pointing video, and I think I've pointed out everything that I've needed to. So I hope it's been useful, and let us know which method you prefer. We'll be posting more videos like this, so keep an eye out for them and don't forget to subscribe. Bye for now and take care.